I opened the certified letter from Pinellas County's planning department and felt my stomach drop as I read the first line about my property being rezoned from residential to commercial without my knowledge or consent. My name is Paul Henderson, and I had owned my 3-acre parcel in Clearwater, Florida for 7 years, a beautiful piece of land with a ranch-style home I had built myself and enough space for my woodworking shop and my daughter's horses. The letter stated that according to their records, I had been notified of the zoning change 6 months prior and had failed to object during the public comment period, which was absolute nonsense because I had never received any such notification. I called the county planning office immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed the number. A woman named Jennifer answered and pulled up my file while I waited, the hold music doing nothing to calm my racing heart. When she came back on the line, she sounded confused herself. Mr. Henderson, according to our records, your HOA submitted the rezoning request on behalf of all properties in the Sunset Meadows subdivision. The notification was sent to your HOA's registered agent, a Mrs. Deborah Patterson, who was supposed to distribute the information to all homeowners. I felt heat rising in my face. Deborah Patterson was the president of our HOA, a woman who had made my life miserable since the day she took office 3 years ago. She was one of those people who thrived on control and had turned our once peaceful neighborhood into her personal fiefdom. The Sunset Meadows HOA had started as a voluntary organization meant to coordinate neighborhood events and maintain common areas, but under Deborah's leadership, it had morphed into something far more invasive and authoritarian. Jennifer, I never received any notification about this, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, and I certainly never voted on or approved any rezoning. Can you tell me exactly what the HOA submitted? She put me on hold again and came back with more information that made my blood boil. The HOA had submitted a request to rezone the entire eastern section of our subdivision, which included my property and 5 others, from residential to mixed-use commercial. The stated reason was to increase property values and provide commercial opportunities for the community. The request had been approved by the county commissioners 4 months ago, and the zoning change had officially taken effect 30 days prior to my receiving this letter. What does this mean for my property? I asked, already dreading the answer. Jennifer explained that as a commercial property, I would now be subject to different tax rates, building codes, and regulations. My property taxes would increase by approximately 40%, and I would need to bring my buildings up to commercial code standards within 18 months or face penalties. Additionally, my homestead exemption would be revoked since the property was no longer zoned residential. I thanked Jennifer and hung up, then immediately grabbed my HOA documents from my filing cabinet. I read through the bylaws carefully, looking for anything that gave the HOA authority to make zoning decisions on behalf of homeowners. There was nothing. The bylaws clearly stated that any major decisions affecting property ownership required a vote by the membership, with a 2/3 majority needed to pass. Zoning changes would absolutely fall under that category. I drove to Deborah Patterson's house 20 minutes later, a sprawling 2-story colonial that she had painted an aggressive shade of yellow that violated her own HOA color guidelines, though she had given herself a waiver. She answered the door wearing tennis whites and holding a glass of white wine, even though it was only 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. "Paul," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "what brings you by?" "The rezoning, Deborah. The rezoning you submitted to the county without telling anyone or holding a vote." She took a sip of her wine and leaned against the doorframe. "Oh, that. Yes, well, the board felt it was in the community's best interest. We have the authority to make decisions that benefit the neighborhood as a whole." "No, you don't," I said, pulling out my copy of the bylaws. "This requires a membership vote. You can't just unilaterally change the zoning on people's properties." Deborah's expression hardened. "The board consulted with our attorney, and he assured us we were within our rights. The HOA has broad authority over community development issues." "What attorney? Who did you consult?" "That's board business." "Paul, not your concern." "It absolutely is my concern when you're changing the zoning on my property without my permission. This is going to cost me thousands in increased taxes and renovations." She shrugged. "Perhaps if you had been more involved in HOA affairs, you would have known about this. We sent out an email." "I never received any email about rezoning." Then you should check your spam folder more carefully. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a tennis lesson in 20 minutes. She closed the door in my face, and I stood there for a moment, absolutely furious. I had never been the type to get involved in neighborhood drama or HOA politics, preferring to keep to myself and focus on my work and family. But this was different. This was my property, my financial security, and my rights being trampled. I went home and immediately started digging through my emails, searching for any communication from the HOA about rezoning. There was nothing. I checked my spam folder, my trash, everything. The only emails I had from the HOA in the past year were routine reminders about trash pickup schedules and a notice about the annual Christmas party. My next call was to my neighbor, Robert, whose property was also in the affected zone. Robert was a retired firefighter who had bought his place around the same time I had. He answered on the third ring, and I explained the situation. "Are you kidding me?" Robert exploded. "I didn't get any notification about this either. My property taxes are going up 40%? That's what the county told me. Did you get a letter yet?" "No, nothing. But if what you're saying is true, this is fraud, Paul. They can't do this." We agreed to meet that evening and start organizing the other affected homeowners. Robert called the other 4 property owners while I began researching Florida HOA law and rezoning procedures. What I found was eye-opening and infuriating. Under Florida law, an HOA does have some authority over community matters, but that authority is limited by their governing documents and state statutes. According to Chapter 720 of the Florida statutes, which governs HOAs, any material alteration to common property or any action that affects the property rights of individual homeowners requires proper notice and a vote. Furthermore, an HOA cannot unilaterally request a zoning change on behalf of homeowners without their explicit consent. I also discovered that Florida has strict requirements for HOA communication with members. Any notice of a meeting or vote must be sent via mail or hand delivery at least 14 days in advance, and email notification alone is not sufficient unless homeowners have specifically opted into electronic communication only. That evening, all 6 affected homeowners gathered in my living room. Besides Robert and myself, there was Margaret, a retired teacher who lived alone with her cats, Thomas and Linda, a young couple with a newborn, and James, a veteran who ran a small online business from his home. Everyone was angry and confused, and none of them had received any notification about the rezoning. "This is insane," Margaret said, her hands trembling as she held her coffee cup. "I'm on a fixed income. I can't afford a 40% increase in property taxes." Thomas was bouncing his crying baby, while Linda looked close to tears herself. "We just bought our house 2 years ago," Linda said. "We chose this neighborhood specifically because it was residential and quiet. We don't want commercial development next door." James, who usually kept to himself, was red-faced with anger. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan defending people's rights, and now some power-hungry HOA president thinks she can just steal ours? Not happening." We spent the next 3 hours planning our strategy. First, we would request an emergency HOA meeting to discuss the rezoning and demand a membership vote. Second, we would file a formal complaint with Pinellas County's Planning Department explaining that the rezoning had been requested without homeowner consent. Third, we would consult an attorney about our legal options. I volunteered to draft the letter requesting the emergency meeting, and Robert offered to reach out to other homeowners in the subdivision to inform them of what had happened. Even though their properties weren't directly affected by the rezoning, we figured they would want to know that their HOA board was making major decisions without proper authorization. The next morning, I hand-delivered the emergency meeting request to Deborah's house. According to the HOA bylaws, the board had to hold an emergency meeting within 10 days of receiving a written request signed by at least 10% of the membership. With 6 signatures on my letter and only 42 homes in the subdivision, we easily met that threshold. Deborah answered the door in her bathrobe, clearly annoyed at being disturbed so early. "What now, Paul?" "Emergency meeting request. You have 10 days to schedule it." She glanced at the letter and laughed. "An emergency meeting over a routine administrative matter? Don't be ridiculous." "It's not routine, and it's not administrative. You changed the zoning on our properties without our consent. That's a violation of state law and our bylaws." "We'll see about that," she said, tossing the letter onto a table near her door. "I'll discuss it with the rest of the board." "You don't have a choice, Deborah. The bylaws are clear. 10 days. I walked away before she could respond, feeling a small sense of satisfaction at having put her on notice. But I knew this was just the beginning of what would likely be a long and difficult fight. Over the next few days, I contacted several attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes and real estate law. Most of them wanted retainer fees that were beyond what I could afford, but I finally found a lawyer named Michael Rodriguez, who agreed to take the case on a contingency basis. He was a solo practitioner who had built his career fighting abusive HOAs, and he was immediately interested when I explained the situation. "This is pretty cut and dry," Michael said during our first meeting at his office in downtown Clearwater. "The HOA absolutely cannot request a zoning change on individual parcels without explicit consent from the property owners. The fact that they claim to have sent an email notification is irrelevant because Florida law requires proper written notice for any action that affects property rights." "So what are our options?" I asked. "First, we file a complaint with the county and request that they reverse the rezoning. We'll provide evidence that the HOA acted without authority and that homeowners were not properly notified. Second, we can file a lawsuit against the HOA board for breach of fiduciary duty and potentially fraud. Third, we report this to the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, which oversees HOAs. Will the county actually reverse a rezoning that's already been approved?" Michael nodded. "If we can prove that the application was fraudulent or made without proper authority, yes. The county doesn't want to be in the position of enforcing a zoning change that was obtained through deception. It exposes them to liability." I left Michael's office feeling more hopeful than I had in days. He agreed to draft the complaint to the county and prepare the lawsuit paperwork, which we would hold in reserve in case the HOA refused to cooperate. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community clubhouse. When I arrived 15 minutes early, I was surprised to see that nearly every homeowner in the subdivision had shown up. Robert had done an excellent job spreading the word, and people were outraged. The small clubhouse was packed, with people standing along the walls and spilling out onto the patio. Deborah arrived precisely at the scheduled start time, accompanied by the other 3 board members, Vice President Karen Winters, Treasurer Harold Green, and Secretary Melissa Foster. All of them looked uncomfortable with the turnout, except for Deborah, who maintained her usual air of superiority. Karen Winters was particularly interesting to me because I had heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and Deborah were close friends, and that Karen basically went along with whatever Deborah wanted. She was a blonde woman in her 50s who always wore too much makeup and drove a Mercedes SUV with a custom license plate that read, "Boss Lady." Deborah called the meeting to order and immediately tried to control the narrative. "I understand there are some concerns about the recent zoning update for the eastern parcels. The board would like to clarify that this action was taken after careful consideration and consultation with legal counsel." "What legal counsel?" someone shouted from the back. Deborah ignored the question. "The board determined that rezoning certain properties to mixed-use commercial would benefit the entire community by increasing property values and bringing in additional revenue that could be used for neighborhood improvements." I stood up. "Deborah, did the board hold a vote of the membership before requesting this rezoning?" "As I've explained, Paul, the board has the authority to make decisions in the community's best interest." "That's not what I asked. Did you hold a membership vote?" "No, because it wasn't required." Murmurs of anger rippled through the room. I held up my copy of the bylaws. Section 7, Paragraph 3 clearly states that any action affecting individual property rights requires a membership vote with 2/3 approval. Rezoning absolutely affects property rights. "That section refers to common property and shared amenities," Deborah countered, "not individual parcels." "That's not what it says, and you know it." Michael Rodriguez, who had come to observe the meeting, stood up and introduced himself. "For the record, I'm an attorney representing several homeowners affected by this rezoning. Mrs. Patterson, your interpretation of the bylaws is incorrect, and the board's actions constitute a clear violation of Florida HOA law. My clients have already filed a complaint with Pinellas County requesting that the rezoning be reversed, and we're prepared to file suit against the board members personally if this isn't resolved immediately. The room erupted in conversation. Deborah looked genuinely rattled for the first time, her face flushing red. Karen Winters leaned over and whispered something to her, and I saw Harold Green shaking his head. "The board stands by its decision," Deborah said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. "If you want to waste your money on lawyers, that's your prerogative. Actually, Deborah, the real question is whether you want to be personally liable for damages when this inevitably gets overturned," Michael said calmly. "Because I should inform you that requesting a fraudulent zoning change is not just a civil matter. It could potentially be criminal fraud, depending on how the state attorney views it." That got everyone's attention. Melissa Foster, the secretary, suddenly looked terrified. "Wait, nobody said anything about this being illegal. Deborah, you told us this was a routine matter." "It is routine," Deborah insisted, but she was clearly on the defensive now. "Did you actually consult an attorney before doing this?" Harold asked, turning to face Deborah. "Of course I did. I spoke with Richard Blackwell, and he assured me we were within our rights." I recognized the name. Richard Blackwell was a local attorney who handled mostly traffic tickets and small claims cases. He wasn't an HOA specialist, and I doubted he'd given Deborah the advice she claimed. Michael pulled out his phone. "Mr. Blackwell is a colleague of mine. Would you like me to call him right now and verify that?" Deborah stood up abruptly. "This meeting is over. The board has made its decision. Actually, under Robert's Rules of Order, which your bylaws say govern these meetings, you can't just end a meeting because you don't like how it's going," Michael said. "There's a motion on the floor to reverse the rezoning request and hold a proper membership vote." "I'll second that motion," Robert called out. Deborah looked around the room desperately, but she was trapped. The bylaws were clear, and she had no choice but to allow the vote. When hands went up, it was unanimous except for Deborah and Karen. Even Harold and Melissa voted to reverse the rezoning. "This vote is meaningless," Deborah said angrily. "The county has already approved the rezoning. You can't just undo it." "Watch us," I said. The meeting broke up with people crowding around Michael and me, thanking us for taking action. Several homeowners asked how they could help, and we quickly organized a group to attend the next county commission meeting to speak during public comments. Over the next 2 weeks, Michael worked with the county planning department to build our case. He obtained copies of all the documents the HOA had submitted with the rezoning request, and what he found was even worse than we had thought. The application included a document purporting to be a resolution from the HOA membership authorizing the board to request the rezoning. The resolution was dated 6 months earlier and included what appeared to be signatures from 28 homeowners, which would have been the 2/3 majority required under the bylaws. The problem was that the resolution was completely fabricated. Michael contacted every single person whose signature appeared on the document, and not one of them had actually signed it or even seen it before. Several of the signatures were obviously forged, bearing no resemblance to the actual homeowners' signatures. "This is fraud," Michael told me during a meeting at his office. "Not just civil fraud, but criminal fraud. The HOA submitted false documents to a government agency to obtain a zoning change. That's a felony." I felt sick. I had expected Deborah to be difficult and maybe even a bit unethical, but I hadn't imagined she would commit actual crimes. What do we do now? We present this evidence to the county and request that they immediately reverse the rezoning. Then, we file a criminal complaint with the state attorney's office. This is beyond a civil matter now. The county commission meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the main government complex in downtown Clearwater. Michael had submitted our evidence in advance, and the commission had added our request for reversal as an action item on the agenda. The 6 affected homeowners attended, along with about 20 other residents from our subdivision who wanted to show support. Deborah and Karen were there too, sitting in the front row with stern expressions. I noticed they were now accompanied by a different attorney, a sharp-dressed man in his 50s who kept leafing through documents and whispering to them. When our item came up, the commission chairman, a middle-aged man named David Torres, summarized the situation. "We have a request from several homeowners in the Sunset Meadows subdivision to reverse a zoning change that was approved 4 months ago." The homeowners alleged that the zoning change was requested by their HOA without proper authorization. Mr. Rodriguez, you're representing the homeowners? Michael stood and addressed the commission. Yes, sir. Thank you for hearing this matter. As outlined in our written submission, the Sunset Meadows HOA requested a zoning change for 6 properties without obtaining consent from the property owners and without following the proper procedures outlined in their governing documents. More seriously, the HOA submitted falsified documents to this commission, claiming that homeowners had voted to authorize the rezoning. We have declarations from all the homeowners whose signatures appear on that resolution, stating that they never signed such a document and never voted on or approved any rezoning. Commissioner Torres looked troubled. These are serious allegations. Does the HOA have a response? Deborah's attorney stood up. Commissioner, my name is Jeffrey Hartman, and I represent the Sunset Meadows HOA. My clients deny any wrongdoing and maintain that they acted in good faith based on their understanding of their authority under the HOA bylaws. Any issues with signatures or documentation are likely the result of administrative errors, not intentional fraud. Administrative errors? Michael said incredulously. Commissioner, we're talking about nearly 30 forged signatures. That's not an error. That's deliberate falsification. Commissioner Torres held up his hand. I've reviewed the evidence you submitted, Mr. Rodriguez, and I find it compelling. However, I want to give staff time to investigate these allegations thoroughly before we take action. I'm going to table this item for 2 weeks to allow our planning department and county attorney to examine the documents and interview witnesses. It wasn't the immediate reversal I had hoped for, but it was progress. The commission was taking us seriously, and Deborah's claims of acting in good faith were being scrutinized. As we left the meeting, Deborah confronted me in the parking lot. You're destroying this community, Paul. Everything I've done has been to improve property values and make this neighborhood better. By committing fraud, by forging people's signatures, that's not improvement, Deborah. That's a crime. I didn't forge anything, she said, but her voice wavered. Then who did? Because someone submitted a document with 28 fake signatures to the county. If it wasn't you, you'd better figure out who it was, because the state attorney is going to be very interested in this. She turned pale and walked away without another word. Karen followed her, shooting me a venomous look as they left. The next day, I received a call from a detective with the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. His name was Detective Marcus Brennan, and he explained that the state attorney's office had referred our complaint to them for investigation. He wanted to interview me and the other affected homeowners about the forged documents. I met with Detective Brennan at the sheriff's office on Monday morning. He was a thorough and professional investigator who took detailed notes as I explained the entire situation from beginning to end. He was particularly interested in the timeline and asked me to provide copies of all my communications with the HOA and the county. Have you interviewed Deborah Patterson yet? I asked. Not yet. We're gathering evidence first, but we will be speaking with her and the other board members soon. Over the following week, Detective Brennan interviewed all 6 affected homeowners, all the people whose signatures had been forged on the fake resolution, and several current and former board members. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Deborah had hired a criminal defense attorney, which suggested she knew she was in serious trouble. The county planning department's investigation concluded that the rezoning had indeed been obtained through fraudulent means. Their report, which was made public before the next commission meeting, detailed how the HOA had submitted false documents and had never held a membership vote on the matter. The report recommended that the commission immediately reverse the rezoning and refer the matter to law enforcement for criminal prosecution. The second commission meeting was even more packed than the first. Local news stations had picked up the story, and there were cameras in the back of the room. Deborah and her attorney were present, as were Karen, Harold, and Melissa, each accompanied by their own lawyers. Commissioner Torres called the meeting to order and quickly moved to our agenda item. Based on the investigation conducted by our planning department and county attorney, it's clear that the rezoning of properties in the Sunset Meadows subdivision was obtained through fraudulent means. The documents submitted by the HOA claiming homeowner approval were falsified, and proper procedures were not followed. Therefore, I'm moving that we immediately reverse the zoning change and restore the affected properties to their original residential designation." The motion was seconded and passed unanimously. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. My property was no longer commercial, and I wouldn't face the increased taxes and code requirements. But Commissioner Torres wasn't finished. Additionally, given the severity of this fraud and the burden it has placed on county resources to investigate and correct this matter, I'm moving that we levy a fine against the Sunset Meadows HOA board for submitting false documents to a government agency. Under County Ordinance Section 12-43, the penalty for such violations is up to $25,000. My jaw dropped. I hadn't expected this, but it made sense. The county had spent considerable time and resources dealing with this mess, and the board needed to be held accountable. Deborah's attorney jumped up. "Commissioner, that's excessive. My clients are volunteers who made an honest mistake." "An honest mistake?" Commissioner Torres said, his voice hard. "Your clients submitted documents with nearly 30 forged signatures. That's not a mistake, that's fraud. And frankly, the only reason we're not pursuing even harsher penalties is because law enforcement is already investigating this matter. The fine is $25,000, payable within 30 days. The motion passed 4-1, with only one commissioner dissenting based on concerns about the fine amount. As the gavel came down, I saw Deborah bury her face in her hands. Karen was crying openly, and Harold looked like he might have a heart attack. The meeting adjourned, and reporters immediately swarmed us. I gave a brief statement thanking the Commission for taking action and expressing hope that this would send a message to other HOAs about the importance of following the law and respecting homeowners' rights. That night, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The nightmare was over, or at least the worst part was. My property was properly zoned again, and the people responsible were being held accountable. But the story wasn't quite finished. 2 weeks later, Detective Brennan called to inform me that the state attorney's office had filed criminal charges against Deborah Patterson and Karen Winters. They were each charged with multiple counts of forgery and uttering a forged instrument, both third-degree felonies carrying potential prison sentences of up to 5 years per count. The investigation had revealed that Deborah had created the fake resolution herself, using signature samples she had collected over the years from various HOA documents. Karen had helped by notarizing the document, falsely certifying that she had witnessed the homeowners signing it. Harold and Melissa were not charged because investigators determined they had been deceived by Deborah and genuinely believed the resolution was legitimate. The criminal case moved through the system slowly, as these things do. Deborah and Karen both retained expensive criminal defense attorneys and initially indicated they would fight the charges at trial. But as the evidence mounted and they faced the very real possibility of prison time, they eventually agreed to plea deals. Deborah pleaded guilty to 3 counts of forgery and was sentenced to 5 years of probation, including 6 months of house arrest, and was ordered to pay restitution to the county for their investigation costs. She was also permanently barred from serving in any HOA leadership position in Florida. Karen pleaded guilty to 1 count of uttering a forged instrument and received 3 years of probation. The criminal fines and restitution, combined with the $25,000 penalty from the county, effectively bankrupted the HOA's reserve fund. The remaining board members, led by Harold, worked to repair the damage. They held a special assessment to rebuild the reserves, though they reduced the amount by agreeing to pursue a lawsuit against Deborah personally to recover some of the money she had cost the association. At a membership meeting 6 months after the whole ordeal began, the HOA voted to completely rewrite their bylaws to include stronger checks and balances on board authority. The new bylaws required membership approval for any action that could affect individual property rights and established an independent review committee to oversee board decisions. I was asked to serve on that review committee, and while I had initially planned to decline and just enjoy my quiet life again, I realized that I had a responsibility to help prevent something like this from happening again. I accepted the position, as did Robert and Margaret. Life in Sunset Meadows slowly returned to normal. Deborah's house went up for sale 3 months into her house arrest, and she moved away to somewhere in Georgia to live with her sister. Karen stayed in the neighborhood but kept an extremely low profile and eventually sold her house as well. The neighborhood dynamic changed significantly, becoming more collaborative and less authoritarian. I learned a lot from the experience about the importance of staying informed and involved in community matters, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. I'd spent years ignoring HOA business because I didn't want to deal with the drama, and that apathy had nearly cost me my home and financial security. Now I made it a point to attend meetings, read the minutes, and stay informed about what the board was doing. My property continued to serve its original purpose as my family home and workspace. My woodworking business grew steadily, and my daughter's horses had plenty of room to graze and exercise. The whole experience had been stressful and time-consuming, but in the end, justice had prevailed, and our rights as homeowners had been protected. The local media coverage of the case had an interesting ripple effect throughout Pinellas County and even the broader Tampa Bay area. Several other homeowners in different subdivisions came forward with their own stories of HOA overreach and abuse. Some contacted Michael Rodriguez for legal help, and he ended up building quite a practice representing homeowners against abusive associations. One particularly gratifying outcome was that the Florida legislature took notice of what had happened. A state representative from our district introduced legislation to strengthen homeowner protections against HOA abuse and to increase penalties for HOAs that submitted false information to government agencies. The bill, which became known as the Homeowner Protection Act, passed both chambers with bipartisan support and was signed into law the following year. The new law required HOAs to carry liability insurance that would cover fines and penalties if board members acted improperly, which meant that individual homeowners wouldn't be stuck paying for their board's mistakes. It also established a state-level ombudsman to handle HOA complaints and mediate disputes before they escalated to litigation. Additionally, the law required HOAs to provide detailed annual financial reports to members and made it easier for homeowners to remove board members who violated their duties. I was invited to testify before the legislature when the bill was being considered, and I shared my story with the committee. It was surreal sitting in the state capitol in Tallahassee, telling a room full of elected officials how our HOAs had tried to steal our property rights. But it felt important to make sure that lawmakers understood the real-world impact of HOA abuse and the need for stronger oversight. During my testimony, I emphasized that the vast majority of HOA board members are well-meaning volunteers who genuinely want to serve their communities. But the lack of oversight and accountability creates opportunities for the small minority who are power-hungry or corrupt to cause tremendous harm. I argued that homeowners needed better tools to protect themselves and that HOAs needed clear boundaries on their authority. The passage of the Homeowner Protection Act felt like the final chapter in our saga. What had started as a shocking letter about my property being rezoned had evolved into a community organizing effort, a criminal investigation, and ultimately a change in state law that would protect thousands of other Florida homeowners from similar abuses. Back in Sunset Meadows, the new board under Harold's leadership worked hard to rebuild trust with the community. They implemented transparent budgeting processes, held regular town halls to discuss issues before making decisions, and created multiple channels for homeowners to provide input and feedback. The change was dramatic and refreshing. I developed a friendship with Harold through our work on various neighborhood initiatives. He confided in me one evening over beers in my backyard that he had been horrified when he learned what Deborah had done. He had genuinely believed her when she said they had legal authority to request the rezoning, and he had trusted her when she presented the resolution with homeowner signatures. The betrayal had shaken him deeply, and he was determined to make amends. "I should have asked more questions," Harold said, shaking his head. "I should have demanded to see documentation and verified things myself. I just trusted her because she seemed so confident and knowledgeable." "You can't beat yourself up over it," I told him. "Deborah was manipulative and dishonest. She fooled a lot of people, not just you." Still, as a board member, I had a responsibility to the homeowners. I failed them. And now you're making it right. That's what matters. Harold took a long drink of his beer and stared out at my property, where the horses were grazing peacefully in the evening light. "You know what the crazy thing is? Deborah actually believed she was helping the neighborhood. In her mind, the rezoning was going to bring in revenue and increase property values, and that justified cutting corners and ignoring the rules. The ends justify the means. Exactly. She convinced herself that because her intentions were good, it didn't matter how she achieved them. That's the dangerous part. It wasn't really about power for her, or at least not entirely. She genuinely thought she was doing the right thing. I thought about that for a moment. Maybe that's even scarier than if she had just been power-hungry. At least then you could understand the motivation. But thinking you're so right that rules don't apply to you, that's how people rationalize terrible things. The conversation stuck with me long after Harold went home that night. It made me think about how easy it is for anyone, given the right circumstances and rationalizations, to convince themselves that breaking rules or violating others' rights is acceptable if they believe the outcome will be positive. As fall turned to winter and winter turned to spring, life continued its steady rhythm. My daughter turned 16 and got her driver's license, which meant more independence for her and more worry for me. My woodworking business had its best year ever, partly due to the publicity from the HOA case. Apparently, people liked supporting a local craftsman who had stood up to corruption. I used some of the extra income to make improvements to my property, things I had been putting off for years. I built a new barn for the horses, upgraded my workshop with better equipment, and finally installed the screened porch my wife had been wanting for years. Each project felt like a small victory, a celebration of the fact that this was still my property, zoned exactly as it should be. The civil lawsuit against Deborah moved through the courts slowly. The HOA's attorney was seeking to recover the $25,000 fine, legal fees, and other costs associated with her fraud. Deborah had already spent a fortune on her criminal defense, and it became clear that she didn't have the resources to pay a large judgment. Eventually, the parties agreed to a settlement where Deborah would pay $5,000 immediately and an additional $15,000 over 5 years. It wasn't full recovery, but it was something, and it meant the HOA could rebuild its reserves. Margaret, my neighbor who was retired and lived on a fixed income, thanked me regularly for taking the lead on fighting the rezoning. She told me that if the zoning change had stood, she would have been forced to sell her home because she couldn't afford the increased taxes and compliance costs. The thought that my actions had helped her keep her home made all the stress and effort worthwhile. Thomas and Linda, the young couple with the baby, also expressed their gratitude. They had been in complete panic mode when they learned about the rezoning, terrified that they would lose the home they had worked so hard to buy. Linda had cried when the commission reversed the zoning change, overcome with relief. Their baby was now a toddler, and I would occasionally see them walking him around the neighborhood in a stroller, happy and secure in their home. James, the veteran who ran his online business, took a different approach to showing his appreciation. He designed and built a custom mailbox for me, featuring intricate metalwork and my family name. It was a beautiful piece of functional art, and I was touched by the gesture. He told me that standing up to the HOA had reminded him why he had served in the military in the first place, to protect people's rights and freedoms. Robert remained my closest friend in the neighborhood. We had bonded during the crisis, and that friendship endured afterward. We got together regularly for barbecues, fishing trips, and just sitting on one of our porches drinking beer and talking about life. He often joked that the HOA crisis was the best thing that had happened to the neighborhood, because it had brought people together and gotten rid of a corrupt leadership. About a year after the whole ordeal began, I received an invitation to speak at a national HOA conference in Orlando. The organizers wanted me to share my story as a cautionary tale about the importance of proper governance and accountability. I was hesitant at first, not being much of a public speaker, but Michael Rodriguez encouraged me to do it. "Your story needs to be heard," Michael said. "There are thousands of HOAs around the country, and most of them are operating without proper oversight or checks on board authority. If you can help even a few of them improve their governance, you'll be preventing future abuses." So I went to Orlando and stood in front of a room full of HOA board members, property managers, and industry professionals. I told them about receiving that letter from the county, about discovering that my HOA had committed fraud, about the fight to reverse the rezoning and hold the board accountable. I emphasized the importance of transparency, following bylaws, obtaining proper authorization for major decisions, and respecting homeowners' rights. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Several board members approached me afterward to thank me for sharing my experience and to ask questions about how they could improve their own governance. A few property managers told me they would be using my story in their training materials to illustrate the consequences of improper board actions. One woman, a board president from a subdivision in Jacksonville, told me with tears in her eyes that my presentation had made her realize she had been operating her HOA all wrong. She had been making unilateral decisions without proper authorization, genuinely believing she was helping her community, just like Deborah had. My story had been a wake-up call for her, and she committed to implementing proper procedures and accountability measures. That conversation alone made the whole trip worthwhile. If I could help one person avoid making Deborah's mistakes and spare homeowners in another community from what we had gone through, then sharing my story publicly was worth the discomfort. Flying home from Orlando, I reflected on how much had changed in just 1 year. I had gone from being a guy who avoided neighborhood politics and just wanted to be left alone with my property and my family to someone who was actively involved in community governance and even speaking at conferences about HOA issues. Life had a funny way of pushing you in unexpected directions. When I got home, my wife had dinner waiting, and my daughter was excited to show me a ribbon her horse had won at a local show. These were the moments that mattered most: family, home, the simple joys of daily life. The fact that I had nearly lost all of this because of an abusive HOA made me appreciate it even more. The second anniversary of receiving that fateful letter from the county passed quietly. Deborah and Karen were both gone from the neighborhood, their houses now occupied by new families who knew nothing of the drama that had preceded them. The HOA was stable and well run under Harold's continued leadership. Property values in Sunset Meadows had actually increased, not because of commercial rezoning, but because the neighborhood had a reputation as a well-managed community with engaged homeowners and good governance. I continued to serve on the review committee, attending monthly meetings and helping to oversee board decisions. It was work I had never wanted or expected to do, but I had come to see it as important. Democracy and good governance don't just happen automatically. They require active participation and vigilance from citizens. That principle applies whether you're talking about national government or a small HOA in suburban Florida. Michael Rodriguez and I stayed in touch as well. He continued to build his practice representing homeowners, and he would occasionally call me when he had a new case to bounce ideas off someone who had been through it. I was always happy to help, and I referred several homeowners to him who were facing their own HOA problems. One case that particularly stood out involved an HOA in St. Petersburg that was trying to force a homeowner to remove solar panels from his roof, claiming they violated the community's aesthetic standards. Michael argued that Florida law specifically protected homeowners' rights to install solar panels, and he cited our case as an example of HOAs overstepping their authority. The homeowner won, and the HOA was ordered to pay his legal fees. Stories like that reinforced my belief that our fight had been about something bigger than just my property, or even our small neighborhood. It was about establishing principles and precedents that would protect all homeowners from abusive HOAs. The fact that our case was being cited in other lawsuits and had led to changes in state law meant that our struggle had created lasting positive change. As I write this now, 3 years after the whole saga began, I can say with certainty that standing up to the HOA was the right decision, even though it was difficult and stressful at the time. I could have just accepted the rezoning, paid the increased taxes, made the required modifications to my property, and moved on with my life. It would have been easier in the short term. But accepting injustice is never the right answer. When someone violates your rights, whether it's an individual or an organization, you have a responsibility to yourself and to others to stand up and fight back. Not with violence or destruction, but through the proper legal channels, with facts and evidence and determination. The American legal system, for all its flaws, does provide mechanisms for ordinary citizens to challenge powerful entities and seek justice. It's not always easy or quick, but it works if you're patient and persistent. The fact that a small group of homeowners could take on our HOA board, get the county to reverse a zoning change, and see criminal charges filed against those responsible proves that the system can work. I'm often asked if I ever spoke to Deborah again after she moved away. The answer is no, and I have no desire to. I don't hate her. I actually feel a bit sorry for her. She destroyed her own life through arrogance and poor judgment, and she'll carry the weight of her criminal conviction and the damage to her reputation for the rest of her life. That's punishment enough without my adding to it. What I hope is that she learned something from the experience, that she understands now that good intentions don't justify bad actions, and that rules and procedures exist for good reasons. But whether she learned anything or not isn't really my concern. My focus is on my family, my property, my community, and doing what I can to make sure something like this doesn't happen to others. The horses are getting older now, and my daughter's talking about college. In a few years, she'll be off starting her own life, and the house will feel emptier. But this property will still be here, properly zoned as residential, providing a home and a workspace and a connection to the land that I cherish. The fight to protect it was exhausting and sometimes frightening, but looking out at these 3 acres that are truly mine, I know it was worth every minute. The sun is setting now, painting the Florida sky in shades of orange and pink. I'm sitting on the screened porch my wife wanted, the one I finally built with some of the extra income from my business's best year. My wife is reading a book in the chair next to me, and I can hear my daughter laughing on the phone with friends inside the house. The horses are settled in their new barn, and my workshop is locked up for the night. This is what I was fighting for, not just property rights in the abstract, but this specific, tangible life that my family has built here. A life that Deborah Patterson and the HOA board nearly destroyed through fraud and abuse of authority. A life that we managed to save through research, organization, legal action, and refusing to give up even when things look difficult. Tomorrow I'll go back to my workshop and continue work on a custom dining table for a client in Tampa. Next week I have an HOA review committee meeting to attend. Next month my daughter has a horse show we're all excited about. Life goes on, normal and precious and worth protecting. And if another HOA somewhere in Florida tries to pull what ours did, I hope the homeowners affected will remember stories like mine and know that they don't have to just accept it. They can fight back, they can win, and they can make things better, not just for themselves, but for everyone who comes after them. That's the real lesson of this whole experience, that ordinary people have more power than they think, if they're willing to use it. The legal system worked, the democratic process worked, and justice was served. It took time and effort and stress, but in the end, right prevailed over wrong, and that's something worth celebrating. My property is zoned correctly, the corrupt board members were held accountable, and state law was changed to protect other homeowners. Those are real, meaningful victories. As darkness settles over Sunset Meadows and lights begin to glow in windows across the neighborhood, I feel profoundly grateful. Grateful for my family, my home, my community, and for the legal protections that exist in this country to safeguard individual rights against those who would abuse power. The American dream isn't just about owning property. It's about having the freedom and the means to protect what's yours when others try to take it away. That's my story. The story of how an HOA rezoned my parcel without a vote, how the county reversed it, and how their board was fined $25,000. But it's also a story about standing up for what's right, about communities coming together to fight injustice, and about how one person deciding not to accept abuse of authority can create change that extends far beyond their own situation. I didn't ask for this fight, didn't want to become someone who speaks at conferences or gets quoted in news articles about HOA reform. I just wanted to work in my shop, raise my daughter, and enjoy my property in peace. But sometimes life puts challenges in your path that you can't avoid, and how you respond to those challenges defines who you are. I'm proud of how I responded, proud of the community that rallied together, proud of the legal professionals like Michael Rodriguez who fight these battles every day, and proud of the government officials who took our complaint seriously and took action. The system isn't perfect, but on this occasion, it worked exactly as it should have. And now, as I finish writing this and close my laptop, I can honestly say that the nightmare is over, justice was served, and life is good. My property remains mine, properly zoned, appropriately taxed, and protected by laws that mean something. Deborah Patterson learned that actions have consequences, and thousands of other Florida homeowners are safer because of the reforms that came from our case. That's a pretty good outcome for something that started with such a terrible shock when I opened that certified letter 3 years ago.